Well, so you guys sent over a bunch of interesting articles this week. And, the one that really stood out was this news about Israel. They just up and canceled all tariffs on goods coming from the U.S.
Yeah.
Now, at first glance, that might seem like just another trade story, right? But it actually goes way deeper and hints at some really big shifts in global trade policy. Stuff that I think we should all be paying attention to.
Oh, absolutely. And especially the timing of it.
Right.
It wasn't just some random policy tweak,
Yeah.
If you zoom out and you look at this whole global trade landscape, particularly with this whole America First approach lately, well, this move by Israel starts to take on a much deeper meaning.
You hit the nail on the head. You were just sending me some articles you were looking at, trying to understand this whole world of international trade and the impact of tariffs.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to dive deep into the specific event, Israel getting rid of these tariffs, to really understand not just what happened, but why. And to do that, we're going to be looking at reports from Globes, The Washington Post, FOX Business, a bunch of others that detail this whole thing, this rapid policy change, and the context surrounding it, including comments from key officials in both the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Like, we're not just reporting on the event itself. We're looking at why it happened. What were the factors that led to this?
Exactly.
And our goal is to kind of synthesize all these different reports and extract the real core insights for you guys, the listeners.
Yeah.
We want to show you why this move by Israel, which seems kind of small on the surface, is actually a really strong indicator of the bigger forces that are at play in global trade and the kinds of pressures that countries are facing right now.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Like this one thing happens and then it sets off this whole chain reaction.
And it's not even just about this specific trade relationship between the U.S. and Israel. It's a sign, a signal of how even close allies are trying to navigate this really unpredictable world of, a U.S.-centric trade policy.
Yeah. All right. So let's get down to the timeline here. The cancellation happened on Tuesday, April 1st, 2025. But here's where things got really interesting.
Okay.
It happened the day before President Trump was set to announce what he called, quote unquote, a decisive stage in his tariffs program.
Uh-huh.
He even went so far as to call April 2nd Liberation Day for America.
Wow.
I mean, come on, right?
Yeah.
And the White House was out there suggesting that it was going to be one of the most important days in modern American history.
It's heavy stuff.
It's a lot. And that timing, it feels very deliberate, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the sources, you see this wasn't a coincidence at all. There was a lot of anticipation building up to this announcement by President Trump.
Yeah.
And, Israel's move looks a lot like a direct response to that looming event.
Yeah.
And it really makes you ask, what was it specifically that had them so concerned? What prompted them to act so fast?
Right, because it's not like tariffs were a brand new concept, so there had to be something more to it.
Exactly.
And what we were seeing in the reports was this talk of a really major shift in U.S. trade policy. Instead of those more targeted tariffs that we've seen in the past,
right,
there was this buzz about a massive 20% tariff on everything coming into the U.S., no matter where it was from or what it was. Can you even imagine the impact of something like that?
It would have been huge, a complete overhaul.
Huge.
And one report actually pointed out that if we went with this reciprocal approach where the U.S. matches the tariffs other countries put on our goods,
yeah,
experts were saying we could end up with something like 2.5 million different tariff rates, depending on the product and where it came from.
Oh, my gosh.
It's mind-boggling.
Right. It's a lot to keep track of.
Oh, for sure. And, a blanket 20% on everything would simplify things in a way.
I guess.
But the consequences for global trade would be enormous and potentially really destabilizing.
Oh.
And, for Israel, this wasn't just some potential economic hiccup. It signaled a fundamental shift in how the U.S. viewed its trade relationships.
Yeah.
Moving away from these targeted agreements and towards this more unilateral and potentially disruptive approach. That's the key takeaway here.
So let's step into Israel's shoes for a minute. They're looking at this potential sword of Damocles hanging over their heads.
Right.
And it seems like their main reason for canceling these tariffs was pretty straightforward. They wanted to avoid getting hit by this potential blow.
Yeah, self-preservation.
That's understandable.
For sure. And, Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and Finance Minister Smotrich, they came right out and said it, that the move was specifically to avoid these possible tariffs from the U.S.
It was a preemptive strike.
It was. And Finance Minister Smotrich, he seemed to get it.
Yeah.
He seemed to understand that the U.S. under Trump was really serious about changing the whole game of international trade based on this America First and national security strategies.
Right.
And the important thing to remember here is that even close allies, they weren't necessarily going to be exempt from these potential tariffs. It was a whole new ballgame.
But it wasn't just about dodging tariffs, was it? It seemed like Israel also wanted to, kind of smooth things over with the U.S., strengthen that alliance, and keep those good trade relations going.
Absolutely.
I mean, the U.S. is their biggest trading partner, with about $34 billion in trade just last year, in 2024. That's not something you want to mess with.
No, not at all. And it makes you think about the bigger picture here. International trade, it's not just about economics. It's deeply tied to these political alliances and these strategic partnerships.
Right.
So Israel's move here, you could see it as an investment in that relationship.
Yeah.
Way to show that they're committed to the alliance.
More than just business.
Yeah, exactly. It goes beyond just the money.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here.
Yeah.
What exactly did Israel cancel?
Okay.
We know it was the leftover tariffs on goods coming from the U.S.
Yeah.
But what kind of goods are we talking about?
From what the reports say, it seems like it was mainly agricultural products. And get this, these tariffs, they weren't even that big of a deal in terms of money. We're talking about just NIS, $42 million a year, which is like what, about $11 million?
Wow, so a drop in the bucket compared to that $34 billion.
Exactly, a drop in the bucket. So, in the grand scheme of this huge trade relationship, there wasn't a massive amount of money at stake.
So we're looking at things like apples, pears, persimmons, almonds, potatoes, tomatoes, even peanuts, hummus, processed corn, and frozen veggies. It's a pretty specific list of agricultural stuff,
Right.
which makes you wonder, if the financial impact was so small, why were these tariffs even in place to begin with?
It's a good question.
Especially since the U.S. and Israel have had this free trade agreement going all the way back to 1985. And by 1995, they'd already gotten rid of most tariffs on manufactured goods.
Yeah, and that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Because despite this free trade agreement, Israel kept some tariffs, especially on these agricultural goods. And the main reason for that, it seems, was to protect their own local farmers and make sure they had a certain level of food security.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah, it's a pretty common thing for countries to do.
Yeah.
They want to safeguard their domestic agriculture from getting swamped by cheaper imports.
Protect what they can grow themselves.
Exactly. And there was also this recent reform in Israel where they were trying to align with European import standards. It was this thing called, what's good for Europe is good for Israel. And apparently, that caused a little bit of friction with the U.S. administration.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some people in the U.S. saw it as maybe favoring European standards over American ones, and possibly even creating new barriers to trade, even if they weren't technically tariffs. So in this environment where everyone's on edge about tariffs, even these seemingly small things could become targets.
Yeah, so even though those tariffs weren't a big financial burden, they were still enough to put Israel on the radar.
Exactly. They made Israel a potential target for those U.S. reciprocal tariffs.
It's all about perception, isn't it?
A lot of it is.
Okay, so it wasn't just about canceling the tariffs, right? Israel also did something else interesting.
Oh.
They updated that what's good for Europe is good for Israel reform to include automatic approval for products that met U.S. standards.
Yeah, it was like a little olive branch.
It seems like it was more symbolic than anything with real practical impact, though, right?
Yeah, most of the stuff the U.S. exports already met EU standards anyway.
So it was more about sending a message.
Right, exactly. The sources even describe it as more declarative than practical.
Okay.
But think about it this way. In terms of strengthening ties and trying to stay in the U.S.'s good graces, it was another gesture, another way to signal that they were willing to play ball.
It's like saying, see, we're on your side.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating goodwill and flexibility.
So, besides avoiding those potential tariffs from the U.S., were there any other benefits for Israel in getting rid of these? I remember seeing something about Israeli leaders suggesting it could increase competition and maybe even make things cheaper for people there.
Yeah, that was the hope.
Oh.
The idea is that by removing these protections, U.S. agricultural products would be more readily available, maybe even at lower prices, which would boost competition in the Israeli market.
Make things more affordable. That's always good.
In theory, right. And then there's also this long-term goal of diversifying the economy. But honestly, considering how small those tariffs were, the immediate impact on prices might not be that noticeable.
So it's a bit of a gamble.
It is, for sure. And that brings us to the concerns within Israel.
Right, because there's always another side to the coin.
Always.
And it seems like the main worry is what this is going to do to those local Israeli farmers.
Yeah, the people on the ground.
They had some protection from being, as one report put it, flooded by cheap agricultural products. Now that those tariffs are gone, they're going to face a lot more competition.
Yeah, and it's a valid concern. And the Israeli government, to their credit, they seem to recognize that.
They do.
Yeah, Dan Katarevis from the Israeli Federation of Binational Chambers of Commerce and Industry, he pointed out that these tariffs were partly there to protect the local agriculture industry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, so the sources say the Israeli government is now looking at ways to support these farmers to make sure they can still produce and, importantly, to ensure national food security.
You can't just take away protections without having a plan B, right?
Exactly. You've got to think about the consequences for your own people.
This whole situation really shows what international trade looks like under President Trump's America First policy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a prime example.
Just the possibility of these big tariffs, even on a close ally like Israel, it shows that the U.S. is putting its own interests first and foremost. And it's this idea of reciprocity, right? You do something to us, we'll do it right back to you.
Exactly. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Or else.
It's putting pressure on other countries to change how they do trade to line up with the U.S.
Right, it's like a power play.
Yeah, it is. And it's not even about whether those tariffs actually happen. It's the threat of them that has everyone scrambling.
Yeah, you're right.
It's fascinating how much influence the U.S. has in global trade just by hinting at what it might do.
It's like they're holding all the cards.
And that brings us back to Dan Katarevis. He had some really interesting insights. He basically said it was kind of an open secret that the U.S. administration was likely to retaliate against any country that had tariffs on American goods.
Yeah.
So for Israel, this wasn't about being proactive or starting something new. It was about protecting themselves.
It was a defensive move.
Exactly. They were trying to head off any potential trouble from their biggest trading partner. And it sounds like it wasn't just one person making this call. The reports made it clear that it was a team effort with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Finance Minister Smotrich, and Economy Minister Barkat all involved.
Right. When you see that many high-level officials all working together on something like this, it shows you how seriously they were taking it.
It wasn't just some routine decision. This was a big deal.
It was. And it was a direct response to a perceived threat to their relationship with the U.S., both economically and politically.
So to bring it all back to you, our listeners, what does this really mean? This whole deep dive into Israel getting rid of its tariffs shows just how much power a country like the U.S. has in shaping global trade.
Yeah, it's a real eye-opener.
It highlights this delicate balancing act that countries have to do all the time, trying to protect their own economies while also keeping those important relationships with other countries.
Right, it's a tough spot to be in.
And the fact that a longtime ally like Israel felt like they had to do this to get rid of even these small tariffs, it just shows how much things could change in the world of trade.
And it raises a really interesting question. If a close ally like Israel felt like they had to make this move to avoid problems with the U.S., what does that mean for other countries that aren't as close to the U.S.?
That's a good question.
And what happens if these big economies start using tariffs as their main tool in trade? I mean, think about the long-term effects on global trade. This situation with Israel and the U.S., it might seem like a specific thing.
Yeah.
But it actually opens up a much bigger conversation about how stable and predictable international trade is going to be in the years to come.
It makes you wonder what other changes we might see as countries try to figure out this new world of global trade.
Exactly. It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Lots to think about, for sure. Thanks for breaking it down for us.
Yeah, no problem. Glad we could dig into this.